Greetings, fellow Rotarians and guests. My name is Joe Young, and it's my honor to serve as the 2020-2021 President of the Rotary Club of Columbus. Founded in 1915 with our first meeting in February of 1916, our club is one of the oldest and largest within Rotary International. Our membership includes a diverse set of leaders within business, city government, military affairs, healthcare, education, arts and culture, social services, and ministry, all sharing a common desire to improve our community and have a positive impact on the world around us. The world needs Rotary and the ideals that we represent now more than ever. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically changed the way we live, work, and interact with one another. School-aged children that were already struggling with food insecurity and educational development are falling further behind. Recent acts of violence perpetrated against our African American brothers and sisters have further highlighted the fact that systemic racism continues to plague our nation. Political division and social unrest continue unabated. The world needs our leadership. And while these are extremely difficult challenges to overcome, Rotary is well positioned to be part of the solution. I long for the day when it will be safe for us to meet and fellowship again in person. Until then, please keep wearing your mask, please keep loving each other, and please keep serving others above yourselves. On behalf of my wife Vicki and our daughters Katie and Lynn, I want to thank you for all that you are doing to make our community a better place to live. It's my pleasure to serve alongside you. Now let's get to work. Greetings and welcome to the August 19th, 2020 meeting of the Rotary Club of Columbus. Whether you're joining us as a member or a guest, we're so glad to have you here with us. As we begin today's meeting, I want to take a moment just to extend our club's condolences to the family and friends of Rotarian Stephen Tondy. Stephen was a member of our club for several years, and he was a colleague to me and others within our club working at Synovus, and we just wanted to extend our condolences following his death this past week. Our pledge this week is going to be brought to us by Hobbs and Mallory Clements, children of Rotarian Brad Clements.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hobbs and Mallory, thank you guys so much in leading us in the pledge. You did a fantastic job. It's our club's tradition every week to honor and recognize an active duty soldier at Fort Benning. I'm proud to call on Rotarian Pete Jones with this week's introduction.
President Joe and fellow Rotarians, I'm Brigadier General Retired Pete Jones, standing in front of the Follow Me statue here at the National Infantry Museum to again recognize a great soldier from Fort Benning. Staff Sergeant Carlos Zamora enlisted in the California National Guard in 2005, and while he calls California home, he's a Texan by choice. He also went on active duty in 2007 as a true infantryman who has performed the infantry task both as a light infantryman, a striker infantryman, and also as a mechanized infantry soldier. So I still have to talk him into going to airborne school and maybe ranger school, but he's 1 year into being a drill sergeant here in what is now the reconstituted 197th Infantry Brigade. So hopefully you can see that brand new patch that used to grace the hills here at Fort Benning and is now back since it was reconstituted less than a month ago. So Sergeant Zamora, on behalf of my fellow Rotarians, I'd like to give you a couple things in recognition of your service and really the service of all the soldiers of Fort Benning. First, you got to have another challenge coin, so I'm just going to hand that to you. And then, because you got 3 kids, 9, 7, and 6, hopefully you can decide which one you're going to take to the River Center the Columbus Symphony Orchestra, Columbus State Theater Department, the Springer, and also here at the National Infantry Museum once we all open up back to the public.
Yes, sir.
But on behalf of the Rotary Club of Columbus, I'd like to say thank you for your service, and please give our best to the soldiers, drill sergeants, and officers at Fort Benning who are doing their duty every day. Thank you. Cool. You have a chance, you can address the crowd.
I want to say thank you to the Rotary Club for everything you do for your community and also for the military community. I appreciate being selected to be recognized, and I just want to say a great big thank you to everything you do. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, my fellow Rotarians, and I hope you all have a safe and a great week.
Staff Sergeant Zamora, again, on behalf of our almost 300 members, I want to thank you for your service and sacrifice for our country. We look forward to hosting you in person for lunch at some time in the future. It's now my pleasure to introduce a couple of other soldiers that have managed to join us today. I'm going to pan the camera around here so that you can see. So this is Private First Class Trystan Tuitasi. Private First Class Tuitasi is going to tell us a little bit about himself for everybody here. So, welcome.
Hello, my name is Trystan Tuitasi, and I work for 247 Infantry Battalion as an S1 clerk. And I'm from Sacramento, California, and I've been in for about 2 years now.
Great. Well, Private First Class Tuitasi, we're so glad to have you join us today. And on behalf of our club, I want to extend a couple of gifts. First thing I have for you is a Rotary Challenge coin that's got our 4-way test on it. And so keep that handy and make it available. Now also I have a passport to the arts, which gives you 2 tickets each to the Columbus Symphony, the River Center, the Columbus State University Theater Department, the Springer, as well as the National Infantry Museum. So I hope that you and your wife can take advantage of that here in the next few weeks. But we're so glad to have you join us today.
Thank you, sir.
All right. And now I've got coming in Sergeant First Class Jonathan St. Armour.
Hey, how you doing, Mr. Young?
We're so glad to have you joining us as well.
Yes,
and so tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, Sergeant First Class St. Armour. I'm from North Carolina. Been in the Army for 11 years, and I'll be PCSing around next year to another state. And I appreciate you inviting me here. This is my second time here, and second time at Fort Benning also in great city. And I'd love to retire here one day.
That's
Yes,
great.
sir.
Well, we're sorry to lose you to the community next year, but
Yes, sir.
we'll be glad to have you coming back here soon.
Yes, sir.
And so same thing for you here is the Rotary coin with the 4-way test.
Yes, sir.
And then also we have the passport to the arts for you and your wife as
Excellent.
well. So you guys enjoy. We're so glad to have you. Thank you for your service and sacrifice. Please extend our gratitude
Yes,
to the other men and women that serve with you.
Yes,
down on post.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks again. Columbus Consolidated Government has been awarded funds that were federal funds as part of the CARES Act legislation that was passed in March. There's $34 million available to businesses, organizations, nonprofits for COVID expense reimbursement. Marquette McKnight is now going to share a little bit more information about this program for us.
Good morning, fellow Rotarians and President Joe. I am delighted to be able to tell you a little bit about the Columbus CARES program, which is part of the Federal Coronavirus AIDS Relief and Economic Security Act. Your Columbus Consolidated Government has decided to take the money that was meant from the federal government to the states, to the counties, and share it with the citizens and the residents and the taxpayers of our community through nonprofit agencies, small local businesses, arts organizations, community assistance organizations, and medical health organizations. It's a wonderful opportunity to recover, for many of us, to help recover from the economic impact that this has had. The CARES program is meant for COVID-related, unreimbursed expenses that you expense during the pandemic. There's a lot of information. The best thing that I can do is tell you to look at the website, which is columbusga.gov/ColumbusCares, or email us at columbuscares@ columbusga.gov. Those would be the best ways for you to get the information that you need, and the website has a plethora of information besides having the application and all the FAQs and the overview that you'll need to apply. There is a Zoom session that I have sent the link to President Ryan, and hopefully they can get that out to all Rotarians. There's a Zoom session on Thursday, August 20th at 4 p.m. that you're welcome to come in and look at. We'll go through the application process and how you apply for this, what supporting documents you'll need. The big thing is that the deadline for applications is this Monday, August 24th at 5 p.m. So you've got to work quickly to get that application in. Your Columbus Consolidated Government is working for you on this one, and we are delighted to be able to be a partner with them and to help the citizens of our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marquette. We're going to make sure to get that information out to all of our members with the web address as well. So, but I appreciate you giving us that update. We have tomorrow, you guys should all have on your calendar, Mary celebrating 99 years on this earth, and we're so happy to be able to celebrate with her. We're going to be gathering at 5:45 at the Columbus High School parking lot. From there, we're going to line up, and we're going to have a police escort drive us past Mary's house, and that will be a lot of fun. You know, if you want to decorate your cars and hoop and holler and wave, I know she'll be quite excited. For those of you that are able to hang out afterwards, after the initial parade, if you just want to circle around and park and come stand at a socially distanced manner with your mask and visit, that would be great. We're going to hang out from 6 to 7:30 tomorrow night. So look forward to hopefully seeing all of you guys there. Our program today is going to be introduced by Rotarian Marianne Richter. And Marianne, I'll call on you now to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, President Joe, and good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who's somebody I have the honor to work with at the museum, Rebecca Bush, our Curator of History and Exhibitions Manager. At the Columbus Museum, Rebecca has been responsible for numerous exhibitions, programs, acquisitions, and special projects. A partial list of her projects here includes exhibitions on the Jewish heritage of the Chattahoochee Valley, the enslaved autistic musician Blind Tom Wiggins, the desegregation of the local public library system, and Southern Gothic author Carson McCullers. Rebecca's outstanding work at the Columbus Museum also includes conceiving of and leading the special project Making Conversation with Warren Williams Homes, which included residents' oral histories, an exhibition at the museum, and a commissioned public sculpture placed at Warren Williams Homes. Rebecca serves on the board of the Georgia Association of Museums, and she chaired the host committee for the organization's January 2020 joint conference, which was held in Columbus in collaboration with the Alabama Museums Association. Prior to arriving in Columbus in 2011, Rebecca worked with house museums at Historic Columbia in South Carolina. She earned a bachelor's degree in history from Kansas State University and a master's degree in public history from the University of South Carolina. Locally, Rebecca is a member of the Bob Barr Community Band and Edgewood Presbyterian Church Choir. Currently on view on our third floor is the exhibition Rebecca organized, And So She Did, Women of the Chattahoochee Valley, which commemorates the ratification of the 19th Amendment. She joins us today to speak about women's suffrage and the passage of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago. Please join me in a Rotary welcome to Rebecca Bush.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for that great introduction. And thank you to Joe and all the Rotarians for having me with you today. I'm so excited to speak to all of you about an anniversary that I'm really excited about, which is the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So I have quite a challenge today. I'm going to try to give you an overview of women's suffrage in the US in 20 minutes or less. Which for those of you who may know me know that will be an adventure for me, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And it helps if I remember to share my screen. Let's see. There we go, I believe. Yep, okay. So the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in the United States is really intimately tied to the history of the abolition movement. And it kicks off in 1840 when Lucretia Mott, who was a well-respected Quaker preacher, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who she and her husband were both very interested in the abolition movement. These two women were barred from attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. This prompted them to hold a women's convention in the US and really started them down this path of advocating for women's rights, specifically in the US, because they were being shut out of these abolitionist meetings that they felt were extremely important. This ultimately leads in 1848 to the Seneca Falls Convention, which took place in upstate New York. This is often cited as kind of the birthplace of the women's rights movement, and particularly the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So we have this pen and ink drawing here. You'll see several women gathered. There's also at least 3 men in this image, and there were men present. The abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison was there, as well as Frederick Douglass. He was the only Black person, man or woman, in attendance at this event. But again, we see these really early intertwinings between the abolition movement and the women's suffrage movement. At the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes the Declaration of Sentiments, which creates the agenda of women's activism for decades to come. So this is something that she might have studied in high school or in a college history class. It becomes extremely influential for laying out the rights that women feel that they should have in the United States, and why they feel those rights are important. Now, you heard me mention that at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, Frederick Douglass was the only Black person in attendance. However, this eventually changes. In 1850, the same cast of characters that I just mentioned also helped to organize the first National Women's Rights Convention. At that time, Sojourner Truth also joins the attendees, and in 1851, at this same National Rights Convention, she gives what is one of the landmark speeches of the women's rights movement, of the abolition movement, really just a great piece of American speechcraft. And I want to take a moment to share a clip of Georgia native Alice Walker speaking a portion of Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech.
There's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and they have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could hit me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. intellect. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now that they is asking to do it, the men better let them.
That is always timely, even more timely now, I think. So as we move past the Civil War, there is a new surge of interest in this movement. Abolition has been achieved, and so you start to see some of these early leaders transition and start to work with new leaders in the field. So here on the screen, we have an image that is probably very familiar to a lot of you. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is seated there, and she is standing with Susan B. Anthony there. They become the two most identifiable leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. Along with there on the right is Carrie Chapman Catt, who really becomes instrumental in the 1890s and then helps to continue to push women's suffrage forward even after the 19th Amendment is ratified by founding the League for Women Voters in 1920 and continuing to encourage women to vote and become politically active. So I wanted to take a moment to do a current event update. Several of you probably heard yesterday that President Trump announced that he would be pardoning Susan B. Anthony, and you might be wondering, what did Susan B. Anthony do that she needs to be pardoned for? And so I wanted to give a little context to that. In November 1872, she and several other women attempted to vote in the presidential election in Rochester, New York. They were arrested at that time and charged with illegally trying to vote. At her trial, a judge directed a jury to return a guilty verdict without deliberation. Before the verdict and the sentence was delivered, the sentence was a $100 fine. The judge asked if she had anything to say. She then gave one of the most famous speeches in the history of women's suffrage. One of the most famous phrases from that speech is the fact that the trial had, quote, trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. Anthony went on to say that she'd been denied justice under forms of law, all made by men, failing even to get a trial by a jury of my peers. She later went on speaking tours and would talk about this incident. One thing that she said at the beginning of the speech, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizen's right, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution, beyond the power of any state to deny. This is after the passage of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees birthright citizenship. So it's really interesting when you think in the context of yesterday's news. On the one hand, of course, now we think that Susan B. Anthony did nothing wrong, that of course women should be granted the right to vote. And so in that sense, a pardon makes sense. On the other hand, Susan B. Anthony herself probably would not want to be pardoned at all, because her entire argument was that no crime had been committed, that she was a citizen of the US and therefore had the legal right to vote. So just wanted to give a little extra context to that news that came out yesterday. 1890 becomes a watershed year in the women's suffrage movement. There's several things that happen at this time. For the previous 2 decades, there had been 2 almost competing women's suffrage organizations that had the same goal, but they had different approaches to reaching their goal, either focusing on federal efforts or trying to go state by state and do it that way. In 1890, those 2 organizations merged. They become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a mouthful, but it becomes a very influential organization for the next 30 years. Also at that time, Wyoming is admitted to statehood, and it is the first state to guarantee women's suffrage in its constitution. Actually, the first 8 states in the Union to guarantee suffrage to women were all in the West. So you have Wyoming, you also have California, Kansas, Oregon, I think Idaho and Montana are in there. So you have these Western states leading the way, which is why I really like this image here. And then also in 1890, the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association is founded right here in Columbus by these women on your screen. These are the Howard sisters, in relation to the Schuyler sisters, if you've been watching Hamilton. The Howard sisters grew up as members of a privileged family here in Columbus, but their father died when they were very young, and they watched their mother have to bear the burden of his debts and pay taxes on land and on his business interests, while she had no vote in who represented her and set those laws about those taxes and business interest. And so in 1890, they and their mother formed this statewide chapter of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association. And here on this screen, we have Miriam Howard DuBose there on the left, Claudia Howard Maxwell there on the right. And in the center, we have Helen Augusta Howard, who is really the ringleader. Helen Augusta Howard is one of my favorite characters in Columbus history. I could talk to you for 30 minutes just about her. She comes to kind of an unfortunate end due to a very unfortunate incident with a shotgun and a young boy who was trespassing on her property. She lives out the rest of her life out of state in New York. We don't actually know if her brothers, who eventually became her wards after, who eventually became kind of her guardians after she was declared mentally unfit. We don't know if they ever even actually allowed her to vote. But in 1890, she was very instrumental in women's suffrage here in Columbus. She helped organize a national convention, that national organization I talked about earlier. She helps ensures that it comes to Atlanta and gives a speech there. She later brings Susan B. Anthony to Columbus to speak after that convention. And we are very fortunate to have on view at the museum right now the dress that she wore at that convention in 1895. So you can see it there on your screen. She never married. She wore trousers. She was a vegetarian and an atheist. She dabbled in spiritualism. She was a very unusual woman for her time. But she never compromised for better or for worse. So she's one of our local suffrage leaders. I also want to give a mention to Adella Hunt Logan, who was born in Sparta in Middle Georgia, and then ends up living most of her life in Tuskegee. Though she was very light-skinned and could pass for white, she did marry a darker-skinned African-American man. She was the first librarian at Tuskegee Institute, and she wrote numerous essays calling for women's suffrage to include both white and African-American women. She was published in The Crisis, which was the influential national magazine of the NAACP. She was also able to attend women's suffrage conventions because she could pass for white and travel more safely than several other African-American suffragists could. Her story, unfortunately, also comes to a tragic end. She dies by suicide in 1915, again, before she ever gets the chance to vote. but she's also a really fascinating figure with local ties to the Chattahoochee Valley. Also working for women's suffrage in the late 19th and early 20th century, you have extremely influential women like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett, both active in the Black Women's Club movement. Ida B. Wells Barnett, really trailblazing journalist who called out lynching and called for national anti-lynching laws. So though their names are not as well known now, certainly in association with suffrage, as Susan B. Anthony or an Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were doing much of the same work and really laying that groundwork for women's suffrage to become successful. In 1913, there is a very well-known march in Washington, D.C. I love this image from it. You see this pageantry, you see the gold and deep royal purple, as well as the white. All of these colors really become associated with the suffrage movement. We have some great pictures from that march down Pennsylvania Avenue that day. So you can see there the dome of the Capitol in the background. These women are on horseback. They are carrying flags. They are dressed in very elaborate costumes. You see this image there. You see they have young girls included as well. And we know there was at least one native of Columbus who marched in that event. Her name at the time was Winona Cargyle. She was born in Columbus in 1893. We unfortunately don't know very much about her time here. Her father was a minister in the AME Church, and by 1900, she and her family are living in Macon, which is where she graduated from high school. But we know that she began her life here, and in 1913, she marched in that event. It was a group of ultimately the founders of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority from Howard University. They marched in the back of the parade. They were not allowed to be intermingled, if you will. Unfortunately, there's not many photographs of them in that event, but we do know that she was present. So there's a great little Columbus connection there. Virginia Causey and I have talked about this and hoping that maybe someday we'll find out a little bit more about her and her family's ties to Columbus. So by 1917, you really start to see a change in the movement. Alice Paul is one of the founders of the National Women's Party. They adapt more extreme tactics, if you will. You see a lot more protest in front of the White House. Many of these women are arrested, and while they are jailed, they go on hunger strikes, which ultimately leads to them being force-fed in as brutal a manner as you can imagine. Just like today, when nonviolent protesters have violence inflicted upon them, that generates a lot of outrage, and eventually more people start to realize that women really do deserve the right to vote. World War I also accelerates this. So you see these women protesting in front of the White House. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? In 1918, Woodrow Wilson actually does go on record and say that he is a supporter of women's suffrage. The war also really helps to start to change people's minds, because you see women working in factories at a really large scale for the first time. We think about this happening a lot during World War II, and that was for a longer period of time. But this also is really prevalent in 1917 and 1918 in America as well. And so this just further adds to the cause that women deserve the right to vote, because they are doing the same jobs that men are doing, and also making sacrifices at home, and they're cooking and rationing and seeing their brothers and sons and husbands and friends sent off to war. So finally, a day of celebration. We were talking before the broadcast began, there's actually several days of celebration. So in the summer of 1919, Congress passes the 19th Amendment. They send it to the states for ratification. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee becomes the final state necessary to ratify the amendment. 3/4 of the states have to ratify amendments before they go into effect. And so on August 18th, 1920, that final vote is cast. On August 26th, 1920, Congress officially recognizes and adopts the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says that a U.S. citizen's right to vote cannot be infringed upon on the basis of sex. So there are celebrations all over the country. There is a rather diminished celebration here in Columbus because there were still many people, especially in the South, who did not believe that women should have the right to vote for a variety of reasons. However, women are able to vote in 1921 in Georgia. At that time, the first woman is elected to the very first Columbus City Council, Anna Griffin. She writes this really great editorial, which I love, where she writes about the new Columbus, which is very interesting. Unfortunately, her term only lasts 2 years. And before that, we think things are too good and it's all upward trajectory from there. Don't forget that Georgia didn't ratify the 19th Amendment until 1970. You can see that's an image from Fulton County, actually, of the day that the voters of Georgia were allowed to vote on that, and it's ratified. So progress is always made in stops and starts. But that is, I did it in about 21 minutes, which is a big victory for me. But that is a kind of a quick whistle-stop tour of the history of women's suffrage in the US, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. That's an incredible presentation, and we appreciate your time with us today. We're going to be taking some questions. I want to encourage all of our Rotarians watching to please post some questions you might have in the comments section for us. I do want to point out, and please forgive me if I missed this in the presentation, but Rabbi Beth Schwartz made a comment to let our fellow Rotarians know that Helen Augusta Howard is actually buried here in Linwood Cemetery here in Columbus. And so next time you have an opportunity to tour Linwood, that might be a special site. Obviously a notable and important Columbus leader that was a progressive and led very important change in our city. And it may be a nice thing to scout out next time you visit Linwood. A couple questions that come to my mind, Rebecca, is you made the comment, or you made the note about World War I. Do you have any estimation as to how long it might have taken for the suffrage movement to have been successful had it not been for the war? Was that really, do you think, one of the most pivotal happenings that led to the success of the suffrage movement?
That's a really good question. You know, it's hard to play revisionist history or alternate history, but we do know that war tends to accelerate a lot of social movements. You think about World War II and the Vietnam War here in the country, and think about how they kind of accelerate social movements happening. So I think by the time the U.S. gets involved in World War I, we are already moving towards, I'd say that women's suffrage, while never inevitable, starts to become much more of a possibility before we get in the war, especially with the tactics that Alice Paul and her group is using. But I think it probably did save at least a few more years of struggle and protest. I'd say it probably gained women a few more years of voting at least.
Wonderful. Was back to the ratification. Are there any, and I should know this probably, but I don't. Are there any states that ratified later than Georgia, or that possibly never ratified?
Oh, and you know, I knew this a few months ago, and now I've forgotten it. I want to say, I hate to single out any states incorrectly. I feel like maybe Mississippi, maybe was the last state to ratify quite recently. I believe all the states have ratified now, but Georgia was definitely one of the very last, unfortunately. There's this law passed that allows Georgia women to vote, but actually a lot of Georgia women aren't even allowed to vote in 1920 because they put in this ticky-tack rule about you have to register so many days before the election, and they didn't bother to pass the law until, say, 2 weeks before the election. So Georgia women actually have to wait one more full year before they get to vote.
Well, and that's an interesting point you make. That would probably have been accurately referred to in that time as voter suppression following the passage of the amendment. And as you demonstrated, the relevance that we read about and watch about today. Here is a question from a Rotarian. How did movement in the U.S. compare or line up with movements in the United Kingdom or Canada and elsewhere in the Western world?
That's a really great question. I'm going to be honest, I don't know that off the top of my head, but there is a similar movement going on kind of at the same time in Britain, right? I always think about, probably my first introduction to the idea of women's suffrage was watching Mary Poppins when I was a kid, and Mrs. Banks is a suffragette, and she has a ribbon, and she's going to all the suffragette parades. So there's very similar tactics being followed there. There are also hunger strikes being utilized in Britain. So you see, just like today, you see women in the US and the UK learning from each other, kind of adapting and adopting what works in one country for work in another country. And I will point out one thing that Virginia Causey and I have talked about. Lots of times you'll hear people use the phrase suffragette and suffragist interchangeably. And historically, suffragette was the term for folks working in Britain, and suffragist was the term for women working in America. So if you want to be really specific about your terminology, you can bust that out.
That's very interesting. And just an update from a Rotarian fact checker here. He did confirm you're correct. Mississippi was the last to ratify. That was 1984. So
okay.
14 years after Georgia, or was Georgia 1980 or 1970? 70. So 14 years after Georgia, Mississippi followed. What, in your opinion, are the greatest opportunities for continued progress for women's rights?
Oh, wow.
That's a big question.
It is a big question. I know we're in a very political season right now, and Rotary is a nonpartisan organization. I will say that I think one of the biggest things I would like to see change is more equal representation in our national Congress and state legislatures and city government. We know that women are about, I think it's 51% of the population worldwide, but there is nowhere near equal representation within our elected bodies. So I think that when we have more women in those elected bodies, women from all different types of backgrounds and life experiences and diverse views, I believe that we'll start to see even more advancements, not just in women's rights, but in human rights and the challenges that we all face, because women are not just women, they're people, right? And they have valuable perspectives and viewpoints. And so that just equal representation in our elected bodies, I think, is really important, which is why it's really vital to not just go out and vote, but to also think about running for elected office or to support great women candidates who are running.
Great answer. Here's another question, and this is very, very detailed, but I'm just sort of curious. Thinking about the women's vote on a national scale, and specifically in the context of a presidential race, since the amendment was passed, are you aware of any presidents that may not have been president had it not been for the women's vote? You know, in other words, did the addition of the women's vote actually result in a different outcome for any particular president in our history?
That's a really great question. I think that would require a really detailed statistical analysis that possibly somebody has done, but I don't know it off the top of my head. But I would point to the fact that for at least the past 30 years, there's been a lot of political discussion about the women's vote. Again, the idea that all women are a monolith, but candidates want women, they want suburban women, they want Black women, they want whatever subset of women, but women are almost a prized voting commodity. So I think certainly there's a recognition that the women's vote is very important. We are working on a new exhibit at the museum that will actually address some local efforts about voting and civic engagement. And I'm working with some scrapbooks that were compiled by the local League of Women Voters in the 1950s. And they're putting ads in newspapers and putting circulars in grocery bags and really encouraging women to register to vote. That if you're not registered to vote, you should register to vote because your vote has power and you have a voice in your democracy and what laws are passed and what happens. So I think it's really interesting that there have been concerted efforts around that, really since the amendment is passed, encouraging women to seize on their political power, and the major political parties have certainly recognized that as well.
Great. Well, we are just about at 1 o'clock. I'm going to turn it back over to President Joe, but I just have one more. I'm sorry, President Joe, but how long is this exhibit available for the public, or how long is the presentation or the research that you've done available? Is it available virtually?
So it will actually be up until early January, and I'm gonna cheat for 30 seconds and share my screen one more time, because next Wednesday at 4 p.m. we will be helping Historic Columbus to dedicate the women's suffrage historic marker downtown. We'll be having a great discussion. It will be entirely new content from what I talked about today. Practically, we're going to have great recent college graduate Sylvia Marshall with us, and then Lisa Goodwin from the City of Columbus and Elizabeth Walden from Historic Columbus will be helping to dedicate that marker. So you can sign up for that on Facebook or on our website at columbusmuseum.com. That'll be an online presentation via Zoom. It's completely free. And the museum is open right now. We'd love to see folks in with masks and socially distant. And the And So She Did exhibition will be up until January 10th. And there's also a great take-home catalog. So lots of great options in the coming weeks and months to learn more.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca. On behalf of our club, fantastic presentation. We're so glad to have you in the community and to learn about the progress that we've made. Some interesting points about the progress that Rotary International has made. Initially Rotary at its founding was entirely male organization. Women were allowed to join into membership in the 1980s. I believe it was 1987, though I may have that year wrong, but just in the last month, it was announced that we're going to have our first female president of Rotary International, Jennifer Jones. And so it's neat to see the progress continuing to be made now 100 years after women first got the right to vote. So thank you for talking us through that. And I also enjoyed your reference to Mary Poppins. I was thinking about that as well. Our daughters will adore us and they'll sing in grateful chorus. Well done. So
yes,
you have done very well. It's our club's tradition and custom to honor our speakers by donating a children's book to the Columbus Public Library, and we're happy to do that. A book will be donated with your name inscribed, and so when you get down there to the library, hopefully you have an opportunity to search that out at some point. So, but thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy and honored to be here.
As a reminder to folks watching, there will be a replay of today's broadcast and previous broadcasts on our Rotary Facebook page. We'll also send out a YouTube link later on for those of you that are unable to catch it on Facebook. Our meeting next week is going to be a lot of fun. It's our annual Fearless Football Forecast, or as we are renaming it in light of current circumstances, the Pandemic Pigskin Prognostication. So I hope that you guys will tune in for that. That will be a ton of fun. And again, Mary's
birthday parade tomorrow, 5:45, Columbus High School parking lot. Look forward to seeing you guys there. Wear your mask, love your neighbor, serve others above yourself. Let's get to work.